From the job site to the code book, this is a Pool Envy podcast, where licensed pool professionals speak up. Code, compliance, craftsmanship. Hosted by Jason Davies. Licensed across Wisconsin, Florida, and Texas. Your deep end starts now.
A lot of people fly into Florida for vacation, and most of them assume the hard part has already been handled. Sun, water, resorts, relaxation. I fly into Florida and start noticing something else. Pools, barriers, gates, deck transitions, tile edges, lighting fixtures, small field details that most people walk right past. And on this trip, one idea kept repeating itself over and over again. A lot of risk lives inside places people already assume are safe. Not dramatic failures, not catastrophic headlines. Actually, the opposite. These were places that looked finished, places that looked managed, places that looked like somebody, somewhere, had already handled the safety side of things. Resort pools, children's features, hotel access points, shallow shelves, formal rule signs, fountains, gate hardware, lighting fixtures. Everything about the setting tells the human brain the same thing. Relax. This has already been thought through. And most of the time, people move on without thinking twice. But one of the biggest problems around aquatic environments is that people trust the setting before they understand the condition. That gap matters. The gap between what people assume is protected and what the actual field condition is doing. That gap is where things get missed. It's where people get comfortable. And sometimes it is where outcomes can change faster than anyone expected. Now, before we go farther, I want to be clear about something. This is not an episode about scaring families away from pools. It's not about pretending every imperfect condition is a catastrophe. And it is definitely not about walking onto every hotel pool deck looking for reasons to panic. This episode is about awareness, because when you work around pools long enough, you start to notice that many real-world issues do not begin with dramatic failure. They begin with small shifts, small interruptions in function, small signals that get normalized because the environment already feels controlled. People see water, they see chairs, they see fences, they see rule signs, they see resort branding, they see a children's play feature, and mentally, they move on. They assume the hard part has already been handled. Sometimes that assumption is fair. Sometimes it is not. And sometimes it is fair in one area, but not another. That is the real world. So what I want to do today is walk through a few observations from this trip that illustrates one larger pattern. The pattern is simple. Places can look safe long before they're actually functioning the way people think they are. Let me start with the one that pulled my attention the fastest. There was a children's slide feature at a resort. From a distance, something looked off. This is usually how this starts for me. Not with a code section in my hand, not with a tape measure, not with a complaint already written. Usually it starts visually. Proportion, shape, alignment. Something about the picture does not read correctly. From across the deck, I could see what looked like a clear acrylic panel across the discharge end of the slide. That alone gets my attention. But when I got closer, the detail became more interesting. The panel appeared to extend wider than the slide itself. And once something like that gets added, the question changes. The question is no longer just what the part is. The question becomes something else. What changed because it was added? Did the water behavior change? Did the way children exit the slide change? Did edge exposure change? Did contact points change? Did the discharge start acting less like a free-flowing termination and more like an area that holds water? Those are the questions that matter, and they are questions most people never ask. Most people see a small panel and think, what's the big deal? Maybe it is not a big deal. Or maybe it is. Around water, small additions can change function far more than their size suggests. And children's aquatic features amplify that reality. Children do not use these environments carefully. They hit slides with speed. They lean into edges. They bounce sideways. They brace with their hands. They exit unpredictably. Faces, shoulders, knees, elbows, and feet make contact with surfaces in ways adults would never intentionally do. So when a slide discharge appears to have been altered in a way that introduces a barrier, an edge, or a water-holding condition, it deserves a second look. Not a dramatic speech, just a second look. And this observation connects directly to the larger theme of this episode. People assume that if something is inside a children's play area, it must still be functioning exactly the way it was originally designed. But that's still an assumption. It may be right. It also may be wrong. But the environment does not care what we assumed. The same pattern showed up in a completely different way on the sunshelf. When people hear the term sunshelf, they often think low risk, shallow water, kids splashing, parents nearby, visibility everywhere. But shallow water does not mean low contact. In many cases, it means more contact. This is where kids sit, where they crawl, where they brace with their hands, where they slide across the floor, where they push off with their feet, where they drag their knees and elbows across surfaces while playing. So when you see a chipped or broken tile edge in one of those areas, especially where children's skin is likely to make contact, that is not just cosmetic. That is a field condition. Because a sharp edge does not care that the water is shallow. One of the mistakes people make around pools is confusing shallow with forgiving. Sometimes shallow water is exactly where the highest contact frequency happens, which means something as simple as a damaged edge on a tile can turn a fun environment into blood in the water faster than people expect. That's not exaggeration. It is behavior. People tend to think about depth when they think about risk. They do not always think about contact. This is why field observations matter. Real use does not happen on paper. It happens where children actually move. Now take the same pattern and move over to barriers and access. One observation on this trip happened to be an older hotel pool layout. And I want to be careful here because careful matters. This is not about claiming somebody walks out of a hotel room and falls directly into a pool. That's not the point. The point is how quickly someone can transition from normal space into hazardous space, and what meaningfully slows that down. Sometimes there's a wall. Sometimes there's a visual separation. Sometimes the environment feels controlled because it's part of a resort property. But the real question is not whether something technically exists. The real question is whether the protective sequence is meaningful. How many steps exist between normal activity and water? How obvious is the transition? What interrupts the path? Because when families stay at hotels, there's an unspoken assumption that these things have already been thought through carefully. Sometimes they have. Sometimes the environment reads more protected than it actually is. And that difference matters. Another version of that showed up at an emergency exit gate. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but at the bottom of the gate, there appeared to be a stone interfering with how the gate sat. That sounds like a small detail, and it is, until it affects function, because safety devices rarely fail in dramatic ways. They fail when the small things interrupt how they were supposed to work. A gate is not just an object. It is a function. It is supposed to close. It is supposed to latch. It is supposed to swing freely. If something interrupts that sequence, even something small, the protection changes. And this is the pattern again. One of the clearest examples of assumed order versus real clarity is something everybody has seen. Pool rule signs. Formal looking, well printed, posted clearly. Sometimes there are even multiple signs, and the presence of those signs creates a feeling of control. But signs do not automatically make the environment clear. On this trip, I saw a facility with not one, but two pool rule signs. And on the same deck, there was a large fountain feature that visually looked like a water feature inviting entry. It had lighting, it had water movement, it had scale. And yes, there was a sign that said, "Do not swim." But here's the problem. A sign can state the rule. It cannot undo the message the environment is sending. The environment teaches too. And sometimes the environment teaches louder than the sign. That matters around pools. Especially with children, especially with guests, especially in hospitality environments where people are relaxed, distracted, unfamiliar with the property, and processing visuals long before they process written instructions. When something looks swimmable, usable, or inviting, The sign alone may not be enough to override that signal. This is where design and behavior collide, and this is why I keep coming back to this one phrase. Places can look safe long before they actually function safely. Most pool incidents do not begin with dramatic failure. They begin with assumptions. Assumptions that something looked managed. Assumptions that a feature will still behave the way it was designed. Assumptions that shallow water means low risk, but environments drift. And places can look safe long before they actually function safely. This does not mean panic. It simply means paying attention. Because awareness changes how quickly something gets noticed. And sometimes that small moment of awareness is exactly what prevents the problem before it becomes something bigger. This is where better outcomes start. This is where this whole episode lives. And this is why awareness still matters.
This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice, and it is not site-specific engineering, code, or safety determination. All field conditions should be evaluated in context. Thanks for listening to the Pool Envy Podcast, where licensed pool professionals speak up. Hosted by Jason Davies, licensed across Wisconsin, Florida, and Texas. For more insights, subscribe and join us next time.